South of Waco, at the place called Papa Joe's, I heard him say so. Yeah, about a man named Billy Joe got in a tango. Fella pulled a knife, Billy pulled a gun. And the kind of outlaw he is, Billy asked him, where do you want it?
What's going on, y'all? It's been a day and an age, and finally, it's time to honky tonk. Let's do this. So we gotta start, believe it or not, in 1990. Generally speaking, way too new. And as classic as country wasn't in 1990, and as bad as it would become after that, leading right up until today, Alan Jackson swooped in to right the rails, or at least do what he could at the time. And this is Alan's debut. This is hard as hell to find for a good price, but it is just true, authentic, or as authentic as country could possibly get in 1990. Much like today, there was only a few heroes out there really trying to save it. And there's a couple in this stack. Steel, Fiddle, Tearjerkers, Boot Stompers, one hell of an album. Definitely one worth checking out. Allen has always stayed pretty true to country roots, and there's been a few missteps here and there. But if you can track down a copy of the debut, and this one is a gold stamp promo, definitely worth grabbing. So let's turn the dials back about 2 decades and go to 1969 with Waylon's Just to Satisfy You. Now, Waylon can do just about no wrong, but this is early, pre-outlaw Waylon. And so that means it's an artist without full creative control. And this is a copy that showed up in just absolutely beautiful condition, without any wear or dirt or anything like that on the back cover. And a lot of these classic country albums, that's how they show up. You know, this one, yeah, again, it's not my favorite Waylon, which is that outlaw Waylon. This is kind of, really is generic, late 60s, Waylon still searching for a personality kind of Waylon. There's some real odd embellishments on this album, like waka 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 organ keys, and even kind of a slight Kentucky Rain kind of vocal, Elvis kind of vocal coming out of Waylon. It's not bad, and I'm happy to have it. I'll take any Waylon album that I don't have that's in great shape. This one, just not my favorite Waylon, but still a good album. So that was 1969. Flash forward 5 years to 1974, and you've got you a very different Waylon. The needle hits this, or any of the Waylon albums from the early 70s with the release Honky-Tonk Heroes forward until today. Man, that's like a cold beer on a hot day when the needle hits the vinyl, y'all. And this one is no excuse. This one has some killer Don Brooks harmonica work, some guitar ads from Willie Nelson. And if you're familiar with Honky-Tonk Heroes, which came before this, that was your rowdy, that was your outlaw Waylon starting. And this carries that forward. This one's a little bit more laid back, but still it's just a cool laid back. It's a Waylon laid back. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, the theme song to Dukes of Hazzard. That's a laid back song. That's Waylon, y'all. And that's a laid back, but still very cool Waylon. And this album is very similar to that. It's definitely one worth tracking down. Loved it.
This time, if I should feel unwanted, I won't stay. Each tomorrow will depend on the love you give today. It's all up to you to keep in mind. This time will be the last time.
Now from 1968, we have a Hilltop release, a compilation of late 50s George Jones material called You're in My Heart. And this is just classic late 50s Texas country. It had some early rockabilly elements mixed in there. And Hilltop was a division of Pickwick, and they were responsible for putting out a lot of killer country compilations back in the day. And this one is no exception. It's fantastic stuff. Now, like we talked about in 1990, in 1987, country was in trouble. Things weren't going well. Ricky Van Shelton showed up and tried to help right the rails, just like Allen did in 1990. And this is full of fiddle, pedal steel, banjo, Buck Owens and Merle Haggard covers. I mean, Ricky showed up to save the day. And when you think of what was out at the time, just a year before that, Dwight Yoakam burst onto the scene with his rockabilly, Bakersfield country sound, and it was killer stuff. This is Ricky's debut, and this record is very, very easy to find, and it's probably the best couple of $3 you can spend on a country record. And Ricky started doing a lot really quick, and here's a follow-up album from the next year. This one, sadly, isn't quite as good as the debut, and it seems like at that point, Nashville producers, all that y'all had kind of stepped in and said, we're gonna steer the ship. So of course, things went downhill after that. But that first album, man, from 1987, really, it's hard to do better. So if you want to hear yourself a mid-80s country classic, grab this record. And next up, we have a late 60s reissue of Buck Owens' very first album. There were no Buckaroos yet. Buck would become Buck and the Buckaroos. This is just early, not even quite yet, the Bakersfield sound, which Buck and Merle Haggard are so closely identified with, and even Dwight Yoakam to some degree. This is just early Buck. Classic early 60s country. And it took me a minute to figure out what this one even was, because I'm familiar with his debut, and it's got a different cover. And it turned out to be, like I said, a late 60s reissue. Absolutely killer classic country record. Pedal steel for miles, an absolutely classic killer debut record from the one and only Buck Owens. And here's the follow-up from 1961. This is Buck Sings Harlan Howard. And Harlan Howard is the man that penned many of Buck's greatest hits, and a lot of other greatest hits that you probably know, but may not realize Harlan wrote them as well. The Telecasters are everywhere on this one. Great sound, very similar to that debut. And again, the Buckaroos haven't quite formed yet, but that Bakersfield sound is really starting to creep in here, and you can just see where Buck would go from here before ultimately landing on Hee Haw and kind of tanking from there. But still, at this point, any Buck Owens album you can find up through that Hee Haw point, that means all through the 60s, you're in great shape. Now flash forward a couple of years to 1965, so let's stay on the debut train. And here's the debut from Merle Haggard and the Strangers. This is toe-tapping, soul-searching, put a hitch in your giddy-up kind of classic California Bakersfield country. This is absolutely fantastic. And a nice little connection between Merle and Buck, who we just took a look at, is the write-up on the back. The album is dedicated by Bonnie Owens, or the former Mrs. Buck Owens, current, at the time, Mrs. Merle Haggard. Friends share and share alike, right? A fantastic album and a killer debut. We all know Merle Haggard, and everybody knows Merle Haggard went on to mega superstardom and is still at it today. Now this album, it's got that early Bakersfield country sound. There's a few string arrangements in here that I could kind of live without, that kind of bring it down a little bit. But overall, a killer album, and it's not every day I trip over a copy of Merle's debut. Had to grab it. Killer edition. Now from 1983, we have a compilation of earlier recordings from Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys. And this is traditional, early, true to the bone bluegrass. This is the music, the soul, and the life of Southern Appalachia. And what makes this one cool and important, other than it showing up in the shrink wrap, which is pretty neat, and having a series of really ridiculous pictures on the back from other Plantation Records releases, is that this is very early recordings that include Ricky Skaggs. Keith Whitley and Ricky Skaggs were part of the Clinch Mountain Boys at one point before taking off to superstardom on their own. This is just harmony vocals, finger-picking banjo, good old bluegrass music.
Six white stripes symbolize true patriotism. Through the ages, true Americans have been found. With blood and 7 red stripes remaining, and we'll never.
1967, you have Take This Job and Shove It, Johnny Paycheck. In Fine Boys. Much like the earlier Waylon album I showed you, the guy just hadn't hit his outlaw stride yet. He hadn't jumped on that bus. And so here's where he was at the time. And this is just a selection of Tears in the Beer, boot stomping, classic juke joint tracks. 3 selections for a dime, no charge for the heartache. And one of classic country's most classic pairings, Ernest Tubb and Loretta Lynn. You got Ernest's deep, baritone almost, instantly identifiable Texas country voice, and Loretta Lynn's honky-tonk angel. An absolutely phenomenal record. You know, songs off records like this, like Mr. and Mrs. Used to Be, are the kind of tracks that earned classic country its lose everything reputation. You play a country song backwards, you get your house back, your wife back, your dog back, everything comes back to you. But compared with today's country's drunken reputation, I'd spend my time and money on this any day of the week. Here's a single that showed up, a Sun single. This is Johnny Cash's I Walk the Line and Get Rhythm. Now, one of the problems with Sun singles is anytime a dealer or a shop finds a Sun single, they just see the Sun label, put it up on the shelf for $100. It's not the case. These aren't that expensive and they're not that rare. Not like Sun 78s. In any event, this is Johnny and the Tennessee 2. No percussion, stripped cleaner in a naked chicken, and released before his own first full-length album. 2 absolutely classic tracks that are a pleasure to spin anytime. Quarter, thrift shop. You can still find good stuff out there. Now next, from 1964, Johnny's pretty well established, and here is an absolutely beautiful copy of I Walk the Line that showed up. This album is a starting point for any classic country collection, and it's an album, of course, I already had. I have a 2i Columbia original pressing, but it's got some surface marks on it. When this one showed up in the shrink, dead mint, there was no way I could leave it behind in the bin. It's just a later Columbia reissue. And this is Johnny as he was in the mid-60s. There's really nothing you can say about this album. You got Johnny's baritone, his sense of humor, you have some of the old finger-picking throwback no percussion allowed style of the Sundays mixed with what he was doing at the time. Just jump on the train, y'all, and pick yourself up a copy of I Walk the Line if you're even a little curious about why Johnny Cash is so badass. Now in 1990, Tanya Tucker released Tennessee Woman. And Tanya Tucker had been in country music about as long as Drew Barrymore has been in movies, since they were little wee tykes. Now we talked earlier about how Alan Jackson stepped in to write the rails in 1990, and this is one of the reasons why he needed to do that. Because while this album starts strong, by track 2 it descends into pop, and by track 3 through the finish you'll quickly realize it's much more fun watching grass grow than listen to this album. You got drum machines, keyboards, synthesized duets, horrible. Not a single redeeming country element anywhere to be found on this album. Chuck it in the pop bin and let it keep Taylor Swift company. Downright ridiculous. In 1989, Katie Lang was still a country artist, and this is absolute torch and twang. Now this was a pretty cool album. I hesitated on it for a minute, and it was only a couple of bucks, so it wasn't a big deal. But I knew Katie Lang to be the loungy Tony Bennett collaborator kind of stuff, and I never really gave her earlier stuff a chance. But what we've got is some western swing, traditional country, rockabilly, and still a couple of those loungy moments that really threaten to bring the whole thing down. But Katie's voice is so damn powerful, and it really would have been cool to see where it would have headed had she stayed on this country track for more than just a few albums instead of venturing off. But I mean, the girl can sing the phone book, her voice is just off the charts, and definitely worth picking up for a couple of bucks. It was a cool addition. 1972, one of country's heroes, Conway Twitty, I Can't See Me Without You. Not a bad album. Anything early Conway I will always grab because it's always a worthy listen. And here, you just pull up a bar stool, you slide a cold draft across the polished countertop, and you listen to Conway spin some mid-tempo tunes and tracks and wax wisdom and wane poetic about life and all the things that you can, probably did, and will lose.
Right is wrong. The one to the left is right. I'm looking for the right place to go wrong, and I'll never make it home tonight. Yeah, the road to the right is wrong. The one to the left is right. I'm looking for the right place to go wrong, and I'll never make it home tonight.
I love Loretta Lynn, so it really pains me to say this album is absolutely terrible, but it is, and I gotta tell it like it is. You take a look at the cover, and you think you're gonna be somewhere around in early 80s, and this is 83, kind of a honky-tonk bar kind of situation. That's what the cover says. Look at the cover. This is an early 80s honky-tonk country album, and you trust it because it's from Loretta Lynn, and Loretta is a honky-tonk angel, but it's not. It's absolutely terrible. Much like Tanya Tucker, you got a strong, whoops, I tricked you lead-off track that really has a pulse, but everything that follows after is so syrupy and so sweet, it'll actually rot your teeth right out of your mouth. And there was a time where Allan Coe represented everything that was badass, personified outlaw country, and you can't baptize a cat, or can you? Because in 1986, Allan Coe jumped a plane down to Margaritaville, spun Jimmy Buffett records all day on the beach, and ended up creating his own version of it here, which is an absolutely horrible album. And if I had to guess, I'd say this is the album that Kenny Chesney owned as a kid and spun night and day in his bedroom and based his entire career off of, which also is equally terrible. Huge list of featured musicians on this one, Dickie Betts from the Allman Brothers and so forth. Sadly, it doesn't at all stack up to the rest of his earlier catalog, and those guest musicians don't save it. Truck driving country was huge in the 70s, and the CD craze swept America. Y'all got your ears on? Come on back. And Red Simpson and his truck driving country album, I'm a Truck, were no exception. Now, Red is a collaborator with Merle Haggard and Buck Owens, and for the time, this was actually not bad. You gotta have a stomach and a palate for that truck driving country song kind of sound, and sometimes it can get a little overdone, but this has enough of that California, again, that Bakersfield sound kind of weaved into it, that it's forgivable, and it's actually a pretty good album. The man is 81 years old and still at it. God bless him. And so that's it for this Honky-Tonkin update. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Feel free to leave a comment below if you have one, and I'll catch you in the next video. Later.